The origin story of this event lies in the October 15th designation of Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network as a so-called terrorist entity by the Canadian and US governments. In the context of the Palestine Solidarity Movement in North America, this was an escalation of state repression aimed at a pillar of the left and pro-resistance wing of the movement, and at an organization that could not with any kind of credibility be accused of material support for armed factions in Palestine, but was clearly targeted purely for its political line and leadership. I want to start my presentation tonight by unpacking that designation a bit, putting it into two historical contexts: the context of the targeting of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and the context of repression against Palestine solidarity in Canada over the last 13 months, and then sharing some thoughts on the purpose of terror designations and state repression more generally. For those who haven't seen it, the video of Charlotte Capes from the 2011 Red Sparks Union event on criminalizing people's struggles, and we can drop that into the chat. I'm going to pull a lot of analysis here, but can't cover all the ground that she does in the video, so I really recommend it. And the other videos from that event are also get great background on this topic. The Palestinian Liberation Movement has historically been used as the testing ground for terrorism designations, and therefore gives us the best case study on how these designations have been used by the Anglo-American imperialist alliance since the 1990s. As an axe to try to decapitate revolutionary political activity, and as a lever to try to steer mass political opinion and affiliation. In the post-Oslo Accords period, the late 1990s, this meant designating every Palestinian political faction that rejected the capitulation of the Oslo Accords as a terrorist entity, trying to sever these organizations from their significant political and economic base in the Palestinian diaspora, and to sideline them while incorporating the Palestinian comprador elites into the imperialist order as a security subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. Other revolutionary groups were targeted in the 1997 terror list, but it's clear from their preponderance on the list and its subsequent implementation that the imperialist agenda in Palestine was to be the test case for implementing these new efforts to develop an international regime of repression. Then after September 11th, 2001, the so-called war on terror gave the US the political platform to export its model of criminalizing liberation movements to its Anglo-American imperialist allies, Canada, Australia, and the UK, and to a lesser extent, its European and Chinese rivals. At this point, they also adopted the strategy of purposely mixing up popular anti-imperialist movements with well-financed and often state-linked reactionary organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Colombian paramilitaries in order to sow confusion about the meaning of the list. And of course, once the infrastructure of repression was created, the cops were only too happy to apply it. For example, against the West Coast Warriors Society as the first group targeted under Canada's 2002 Anti-Terrorism Act, and in the crackdown on the support of diasporic Tamil communities for their national liberation struggle in the late 2000s, just to name a couple of instances. Based on my own experience, this imperialist strategy was highly successful. It dissuaded many diaspora communities connected to national liberation struggles from being actively involved in those efforts or from vocalizing their support for them. It created a barrier to activists and prospective revolutionaries developing relationships and learning from advanced revolutionary movements in the oppressed nations. And it made material support, something that had been a normal component of solidarity work previously, impossible. Keeping the consciousness of revolutionary struggles and their significant breakthroughs alive among the masses in the 2000s and 2010s was a real challenge. And it's a testimony to the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and the resilience of the Palestinian liberation movement that despite the best efforts of the whole Anglo-American imperialist alliance, they have rebuilt their unity, their institutions of struggle, and their mass base of political support, even here in the belly of the beast. And the listing of Samidoun was at least to some degree a response to that organization's effectiveness in breaking through the political barriers erected by the war on terror. in consistently and fearlessly raising the standard of the Palestinian and regional resistance forces, naming them PFLP, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, calling for freedom for Palestinians jailed by the occupation, and highlighting important revolutionary leaders like Ahmad Sadat, George Ibrahim Abdallah, and Khalida Jarrar. The second thing I want to look at is the designation of Samidoun in the context of the Canadian ruling class and political establishment's efforts to contain the surging Palestine solidarity movement since October 7th, 2023. The mass movement in response to the genocide in Gaza and in solidarity with Palestine has exposed a profound disconnect between the political positions of a broad section of the Canadian people, likely an absolute majority who at a minimum support Palestinian human rights and aspirations for self-determination, and the position of the entire ruling class and its political establishment, including all the major political parties, who want to preserve Israel as the reliable military outpost of Anglo-American imperialism in the heart of the Arab world at any cost, especially if the cost is paid in Palestinian lives. This disconnect has led the Canadian government and state to use a dual strategy to try to contain the Palestine solidarity movement. On the one hand, fake humanitarian gestures and rhetoric to try to placate the mass concern over the undeniable genocide. And on the other hand, repression, very specifically targeted at people, particularly community leaders and leaders in the movement, who have the courage to go beyond the rhetoric of humanitarianism and ceasefire, and who explicitly uphold the Palestinian resistance and national liberation struggle. United in Struggle had an early firsthand experience of this, as the co-chair of our organization, Natalie Knight, was suspended, then fired from her teaching job at Langara over a speech she gave on October 28th, 2023, upholding Operation Al-Aqsa Flood as an amazing and brilliant act of resistance. There are many other examples here, other firings and job suspensions, hate speech charges for carrying a PFLP flag in Toronto, forced dissolution of an anti-racism committee, and always that implantation of, is saying what I really think going to get me fired or arrested? But let's just follow the thread of Samidoun, because it has been among the most targeted precisely because between October 7th, 2023 and October 15th, 2024, it was among the most visible organizations articulating a clear political line in support of Palestinian resistance and national liberation. So on April 26th, just as the Solidarity Movement was entering a new phase with militant student actions sweeping across the US, Canadian, and European universities, Charlotte Cates, the founder of Samidoun, was arrested, charged with incitement of hate, and given conditions of release preventing her from attending or speaking at any public gathering until October 8th, 2024, an explicit attempt to remove her leadership from the movement. And while, when October 8th rolled around, the lower levels of the Canadian legal apparatus refused to do entirely away with civil liberties and due process and wouldn't proceed with the charges in court, the more direct puppets of the ruling class were already preparing a follow-up. The designation of Samidoun as a terrorist entity backed by a completely unsubstantiated claim of direct links to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the actually ridiculous characterization of Samidoun as having some kind of fundraising function for the resistance. The October 15th designation had an immediate impact on the movement locally, and I suspect in other Canadian centers, demobilizing and empowering a pre-existing conservative element to censure discussion of Palestinian resistance and the actual role of Canadian imperialism in supporting Israeli war crimes and genocide. And the Canadian state's persecution of Charlotte ramped up as they froze her bank account and on November 14th, violently raided her East Van apartment, breaking down the door, throwing in a flash grenade, dragging her out in her bare feet, crashing the apartment and needlessly breaking the bedroom window, and confiscating her electronics, all on a warrant for conspiracy to incite hate, a lesser charge than the one they had already failed on, and for events at a rally in Vancouver that occurred while Charlotte was not even in the country. In the targeting of Samidoun, we can see very clearly the purpose of designations and other forms of state repression. First and foremost, to disconnect militant organizations and leaders from their mass base and to create an example that will intimidate and deter the masses from joining or engaging with those organizations. It's important to understand that they use the tactics of criminalization, terrorist designation, and incarceration as alternatives to other options like mass roundups or attacking demonstrations or banning gatherings, precisely because they want to avoid these types of civil conflicts in which the masses are actually involved, which can easily turn into qualitative leaps forward for resistance and mass struggle. Their goal is to set back and demobilize our mass movements by neutralizing our leaders and detaching large parts of the base who have not yet been steeled in struggle and prepared for repression. And if they can't do it with criminalization and imprisonment, then they try to do it with murder, like they did with Louis Riel, Ginger Goodwin, Anna Mae Aquash, and Maewa Singh, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther Jr., Joe Hill and the Haymarket Martyrs, James Connolly, Karl Liebknecht, and Rosa Luxemburg, Victor Jara, Che Guevara, and Salvador Allende, Bhagat Singh and Gian Saibaba, Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, Benito and Wilma Tiamzon, and Ghassan Kanafani, Abu Ali Mustafa, Yahya al-Sinwar, and Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, and too many more. So if we're going to organize for real change, revolutionary change, we need to look repression straight in the face and take inspiration from these martyrs who paid the ultimate price for their political conviction and courage. We also need to be strategic, unnecessary sacrifice, and actions that escalate the contradictions with the state when we're not prepared to defend ourselves from the inevitable repression don't benefit our cause. Escalation should come when we reach a quantitative threshold of organizing and consolidation that allows us to take a qualitative leap in struggle. So I'm going to hand things off to my co-presenters now and come back to present some thoughts on how we as organizations and movements can be prepared to confront state repression more effectively.